This is Lecture 2 for Music Theory Fundamentals. Many of you will see the symbol on the screen and already know what it is. When I ask classes, what is this symbol? The most frequent answer that I get is, it's a treble clef. And my response to that is, well, you're sort of right. This is a treble clef. This is a G clef. So what's the difference? One of the main differences you'll notice is that one of our symbols is on top of some lines and the other one isn't. What makes the one on the left a treble clef and the one on the right a G clef? The reason we call this a G clef is because, depending on its placement on the staff, we can locate a G on our clef. But let's back up a little. This is a staff. You'll notice that there are 5 lines and 4 spaces. Like all things in written music, our clefs and staves, which is the plural word for staff, have evolved. Our G clef is no exception. Looking at the graphic on the left, you'll see different representations of the G clef from music history. It's evolved to the clef that is most familiar to those of us who are music readers today, the one at the bottom right. This is our G clef and our treble clef. Our standard treble clef shows us where G is located on the staff, because the round, spiraling part of the clef always indicates the location of G. You'll see I have the round, spiraling part of the clef circled in red with a line pointing to our G line in a treble clef. Each of these placements represents a different location for the pitch G. By moving it higher or lower on the staff, we indicate a different place where G would be found. For the purposes of this class, treble clef and G clef will be synonymous. In other words, we will only be working with the G clef as it appears in the standard treble clef position. Let's examine our treble clef here on our staff of 5 lines and 4 spaces. We already know where to find a G. G is our landmark note on the treble clef. So if I am to write a G note on the staff, I would do it like this. The name of this line is G. The name of this pitch, therefore, is G. As our G note moves higher up the staff, the name of the note moves through our musical alphabet: G, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. These are the only letter names that we need when we're writing notes and labeling them. Likewise, we can hear the frequency of the pitch getting progressively higher as the notes move higher on the staff. I'll demonstrate the pitches that are written on the screen now. As we move higher on the staff, and as we move further down our musical alphabet, we hear the frequency, which is the highness or lowness of a pitch, getting higher. There are a few shortcuts that people like to use to help them remember the names of the lines and spaces on a treble clef. Here are some pitches and their labels: E, G, B, D, and F. The one a lot of us may remember from an elementary school music class is, "Every good boy does fine," for E, G, B, D, and F. Another one that we hear frequently is "every good boy deserves fudge." Very similar to the first one. However, my recent favorite is one my husband came up with. "Empty garbage before dumpster fire." The names of the spaces on a treble clef are a little easier to remember. It spells a word, F-A-C-E, or face. As we move through our musical alphabet, starting on the bottom line, working our way up to the top line, we hear the pitches ascend. We see the labels below each pitch, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F. Every time we move to the neighboring line or space, we move forward one letter in our alphabet. So by alternating line, space, we move up a step with each new pitch. Question number 2. What is this? Now, if you were paying attention at the beginning with our treble clef or our G clef, you'll know that this is a loaded question. Many of you would have answered, "Oh, that's a bass clef." However, this is a bass clef, and this is an F clef. In the same way that our G clef allows us to locate G on our treble clef, our F clef allows us to locate F on our bass clef. Our standard bass clef shows us where F is located on the staff, because the 2 dots on an F clef always surround the line that indicates F. Each of these placements represents a different location for the pitch F. This is similar to what we saw with our treble clef. The spiraling part of the clef surrounded the G line. In this case, the 2 dots surround the F line. So we can move our F clef and change the place where we would locate an F. As with our treble clef, for the purposes of this class, bass clef and F clef will be synonymous. In other words, we will only be working with the F clef as it appears in the standard bass clef position. Let's examine our bass clef on our staff of 5 lines and 4 spaces. We already know where to find an F. F is our landmark note on the bass clef. So if I am to write an F note on the staff, I would do it like this. The name of this line is F. Therefore, the name of this pitch is also F. As our F note moves higher or lower on the staff, the name of the note moves forwards or backwards through our musical alphabet. Likewise, we can hear the frequency of the pitch getting progressively higher or lower with the notes on the staff. Here's how our F, G, A, as pictured on the staff, sound. You can hear the frequency of the pitch getting higher as I move from the F to the G to the A. And here is an example of the pitches going lower, starting on our F landmark note and moving down to a G in the bass clef staff. There are also a few shortcuts that people like to use to help them remember the names of the lines and spaces on a bass clef. G, B, D, F, and A are our 5 lines in the bass clef. Some people use good boys do fine always. Some use giving blood doesn't feel antagonistic. And finally, good burritos don't fall apart. The mnemonic I've most frequently heard referenced for remembering the spaces on the bass clef is all cows eat grass. So if we're labeling each pitch from the bottom line to the top line on our bass clef, you'll see that we start with a G, we end with an A. In the same way that we demonstrated for treble clef, we have line, space, line, space. With each pitch moving upward to the line or space that neighbors it, we move one step and we move one letter name in our musical alphabet. Now that we've learned about the lines and spaces on the treble and bass clef, we know how to correctly identify and write notes for 5 lines and 4 spaces on 2 clefs. So that's 18 notes. Here's where we run into a problem. There are 88 keys on a piano keyboard. We've only learned to notate 18 of them. Where are the rest? One way to notate them is by using something we call ledger lines. Ledger lines can go above or below the staff. Rather than running the entire length of the staff and giving us another line to keep track of, they are short. They are temporary. How do we use ledger lines? Let's start with an F at the top of our treble clef. We know this is an F because we can count line, space, up our musical alphabet from our G landmark note, or we can use one of our mnemonic devices to find E, G, B, D, and F. F needs no ledger line because F already has a line of its own at the top of the staff. Remember that moving up the staff in a line space order brings us to the next higher note in our musical alphabet. This shows that the note one space above the F line is a G. G here is above the line. G is a note on a space. It's true that there is no line above the G. When a note is directly above or below the staff, it doesn't need to be surrounded by another line. In other words, the first example of a G above the staff is incorrect. The second example here in the picture is correct, with no line above it. The same is true with notes below the staff. This rule applies to both treble clef and bass clef. You'll see that the pitch in the middle is incorrect because I placed a ledger line below it. That ledger line isn't necessary because the note is still connected to the staff by being one space below. That's a D. There is no limit for ledger lines. As long as there are higher and lower pitches to sound, more ledger lines can always be added. Here we see an A, one ledger line above the staff, a B, which sits on top of that first ledger line, and a C, which is two ledger lines above the staff. Also note that there's no ledger line above B. Next we see the B, A, G at the end of the line. B is one space below our first ledger line below the staff. A is two ledger lines below the staff, and G sits right below that second ledger line. We see similar things right below in the bass clef. Let's try an experiment. How much have you learned? This is a grand staff. We call it a grand staff because it has both treble and bass clef present, and they're beamed together in one single staff. I'm going to write some notes on our grand staff. I'd like you to pause the video and see if you can identify each of these pitches. Assuming you've taken some time to identify each of these pitches, we'll now see if you got them right. If you spelled the word cabbage, then you got the correct answer. Question number 3. What are these? Well, we see each one of them labeled double flat, flat, natural, sharp, and double sharp, but they all fit into a category that we haven't discussed yet in this lecture, and that is accidentals. Let's take a look at our piano keyboard again with 88 keys. Actually, let's take a look at one a little more up close. You'll see that our black keys on our keyboard show up in patterns of twins and triplets. Twins, triplets. This pattern repeats itself across the entire piano keyboard. I'll take a minute to draw a rudimentary example of a 2-octave keyboard. You'll see that I've arranged my twins and triplets. When I draw the lines to represent the white keys, one line needs to come down from each black key, and also there's a line that runs the full width of the keyboard from the top to the bottom in between each set of twins and triplets. I might not get a gold star for artistic merit on this particular drawing, but I thought it was important to show you how to draw a keyboard. You might need to know this on a test. The white key that sits directly below each pair of twins on the keyboard is labeled as a C. This goes for any white key that's directly below the twins at any place on our piano keyboard. Since we found our C, we can now label with consecutive musical alphabet notes every key on this 2-octave keyboard. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and so on. As we move from left to right, the frequency of the pitch goes higher. Listen to how this sounds, only playing the white keys. Next, let's take a look at the accidentals. Once again, we see our examples there of the different types of accidentals: double flat, flat, natural, sharp, and double sharp. But for the purposes of today's lecture, we're going to focus on the flat, the natural, and the sharp. As I label each of these white keys, you'll see that I'm putting a natural sign next to them. For right now, this is optional, but I wanted to show you how this works. A C key, the white key, is a C natural. The D key, that's the white key between the twins, is also D natural, and so on. Each of these white keys can be labeled with the letter that we labeled it from the previous picture, and the word natural or the symbol natural next to it. Let's learn a little bit more about accidentals. As we move from a natural to a sharp, we move to a pitch that is a higher frequency. As we move from a natural to a flat, we move to a pitch that is a lower frequency. We also move to the pitch that is the next door neighbor on our piano keyboard. You can think of this as sharps go up, flats go down. If you sharpen a pencil, the point goes up, or if you happen to sit on that sharpened pencil, you'll certainly stand up quickly. Whereas flats, well, if you get a flat tire, your car is going to sink downward. Let's see how this works on a keyboard. This is a G. If I move one half step away from that G, I'm on a black key known as G sharp. And if I move one half step below that G, I'm on a black key known as G flat. These are three of the pitches on our keyboard that could be labeled with the letter G: G flat, G natural, and G sharp. Similarly, here's a D, moving up to a D sharp, an A, moving down by a half step to an A flat, C goes up to C sharp, F, moving up a half step, F sharp, and B, moving down a half step, B flat. You can label any of these black key notes if you know a neighboring white key note. Where accidentals can get confusing is when we have two different options and we have to decide how to label that key. Here we see an F, which can go up to an F sharp, or a G, which can go down to a G flat. So we have two different options here, F sharp and G flat. We call these enharmonics. Let's find a B on our keyboard and move down a half step. That's a B flat. Here's where you locate it on the keyboard, and here is where you locate it on a staff. The note is on the B line, and there's a flat sign in front of it. Here's a D on our keyboard. I move up to a D sharp. Here's an example of a D sharp written on the treble clef. Let's take a look at how notes represent themselves on the staff versus representation if we're labeling them with a letter and an accidental. You'll notice that on the staff we have four different pitches: A flat, D sharp, G flat, and F sharp. When we write our pitches on the staff, we need to make sure that the accidental, if there is one, is placed before the pitch. When we're labeling them with a letter and an accidental, it's very important to notice that the accidental is always listed after the letter. Why do we do this? Because we read from left to right. If we're reading things alphabetically, we say the letter name, A, followed by the accidental, flat. Whereas if we're reading left to right musically and performing a piece of music, we would never want to play or sing a note and then realize afterwards, oh no, that was supposed to be an A flat and I played an A natural. So what about these pitches? They don't have a black key between them. They're next door neighbors already. Is there an E sharp? Is there a C flat? The answer is yes. It works the same way that we saw this with our black keys. Start on an E, move up a half step to the white key next to it, and you arrive on an E sharp. Start on a C, move down a half step to its neighboring white key, and you find a C flat. E sharp and F natural are enharmonics. They sound the same. They're the same key. They're enharmonics because they have different names. C flat and B natural are also enharmonics. They use the same key on the keyboard. They sound the same. They're the same frequency of pitch, but they have different names. So you might be asking yourself, why do we have two different names for the same pitch? Well, enharmonics are similar to homophones. You learned about this in elementary school English class. Two, and two are examples of homophones. These words all sound the same, but they have different meanings. If you were to say, oh, this is way too much information, you probably wouldn't want to write it with a TWO if you want to get an A from your English teacher. F sharp and G flat sound the same. They have the same frequency of pitch. They use the same key on the keyboard, but they are not the same. F sharp and G flat are spelled differently because they mean different things and they function differently in written music. You might be asking yourself, why? Why do we have two different names? Why is an E sharp also an F? Why don't we just call it an F all the time? Well, here's the point in the lecture where I ask you, trust me. This will be developed and explained further. For right now, what you need to know is they have different functions. In future lectures, we'll go into great detail about what those functions are. To recap what we've talked about today, here's what you need to remember. Treble clef and bass clef. Where are they? What do they look like? How would you write one of your own? You need to be able to identify the lines and spaces in both clefs. You need to be able to write ledger lines and know how to use them. You should be able to write notes with accidentals on the staff. Of course, remembering that when a note is on the staff, the accidental comes before it, never after. You should be able to correctly identify and label them with the letter name and the accidental afterwards. And then finally, you should be able to find the enharmonics. So if you're given an A flat, you should know that one of the enharmonics for A flat is G sharp by looking at a piano keyboard.